So typically, when referencing self awareness as a social worker, it's the social worker attempting to increase the self awareness of their clients. That is, in fact, one of the main goals that a social worker should have for their clients. It's difficult to help a person without helping them become cognizant of their belief systems and their worldviews, and from where those thoughts, ideas, and attitudes originated. However, in Module 8, which centers around the family, self awareness is applicable to the social worker. On page 253 in the Direct Social Work textbook, Hepworth and his co authors state, given the diversity of families that social workers encounter and the myriad ways that families organize to perform tasks, it perhaps goes without saying that social workers who encounter families in their practice will be faced with frequent and significant challenges to their own deeply held worldviews. The text then goes on to say that indeed, all social work encounters with families can be described as a meeting or a mingling of worldviews about families. Given that differing and conflicting worldviews can become extreme, which can lead to oppressive social work practices, according to Hepworth, on page 254, Hepworth and Associates address that by saying that it is critical that social workers be aware of potential worldview differences and act deliberately to understand them. Now, I found this module very thought provoking. I was raised by a father who worked a lot, a mother who taught part time, but typically was home by the time my brothers and I got home from school. My father was a heavy handed disciplinarian, he was very strict. My mother was the peacemaker of the family. And as I reflect on my upbringing and my worldview regarding family, it's really clear to me that this is an area that I'm going to need to focus on because my family system has been the one that's been ingrained in me since birth. It's what I'm familiar with. It's the model that I unknowingly followed in raising my own children. So, consequently, I may have a tendency to view any other type of family functioning as less effective as the one in which I was raised. I can look back, though, and see clearly that our family was not perfect and there was a lot of dysfunction in it. However, since that's all that I have known, all that I knew when I was a child, it is embedded into my head. So I'm going to have to really work on that. Today in 2022, families come in all shapes and sizes, and my definition of a healthy and functional family will have to be broadened to be much more inclusive. I can't narrow mindedly compare and contrast the families that I work with. I can't compare them to the way that I was raised and to my family structure. Now, in an article that's written by Paul Hemez and Chanel Washington on the census.gov website, it states children living with a mother only is the second most common U.S. living arrangement, a number that has doubled since 1968. Now, that's a substantial uptick in single parent households. Now, changes such as that have led to a change in the way that families look and a change in the way that families have to function. And Teresa Bonner kind of addresses this by pointing out the different things that have happened over the last 50 years. The statistics that she used in her article, which was on penlive.com, show that only 46% of children live in the type of family household that was typical in the 1970s. And those are the years that I was raised, the 70s and 80s. Bonner used census statistics from 1960 to the present, as well as various articles and studies to put together her look at how the American family has changed over the past 50 years. I'm going to list a few of the changes that she had listed in her article. It's not all inclusive of everything within the article, but at least it gives an idea of how the typical American family has changed. So, number one, brides and grooms are older because people are waiting longer to marry. Number two, Young adults stay longer with parents or parent. Number 3, there are now more young adults aged 18 to 34 living with their parents than any other arrangement. Number 4, in 1967, 39% of young adults lived with a spouse. Today, that number is just 8%. Number 5, the number of 18 to 24-year-olds living with an unmarried partner is 15 times greater than in the 1970s. In fact, cohabitation is so widespread that women have about a 75% chance by the age of 30 of living with a partner before marriage. Number 6, mothers are waiting longer to have children. In 1960, women ages 15 to 24 accounted for 40% of mothers with infants. Today, they account for 20%. Number 7, women are not waiting for marriage to have children. Number 8, parenthood now precedes marriage for many women. Nearly 40% of all births in the United States are to unmarried women. Number 9, it was found that the share of women at the end of their childbearing years who never married rose from 9% in 1994 to 15% in 2014. 55% of these never married women have had a child. Number 10, in the 1970s, 8 in 10 people got married by the time they turned 30. Today, it's not until the age of 45 have 8 in 10 people married. Number 11, today, 26% of children live with one parent, 15% live with parents in a remarriage, and 7% live with unmarried parents. With those 3 situations combined, that accounts for almost half of the children under 18 living in the United States. Now, Bonner also shared a few other statistics, one of which is that families are getting smaller. Not too long ago, families averaged 2.5 children plus 2 parents. Now, the average family size as a whole consists of 3.13 persons. Working mothers have gone from 18% in 1960 to 67% today. Also, in 40% of families with children under 18, mothers earn the majority of the family income. Now, that number was only 11% in the 1960s. The statistics go on, reflecting the innumerable ways that families have changed within these last few years. And with those changes, traditional roles within the family have had to change as well. Table 10-2 on page 255 in the Direct Social Work Practice Text by Hepworth and Associates outlines the dimensions of a family systems framework assessment. Now, with changes in the makeup of families and the way that families function, of course, there are going to be changes in family roles, communication, family life cycles, family rules, family adaptive capacity, the stressors and the strengths, family decisions and hierarchies, etc. Those things, of course, are going to look different in each family, but a social worker must also acknowledge that the changes within our culture has made a difference in what families look like. So we see all the statistics that I read, and within those statistics, since they are changing and continuing to change, there are many questions that social workers should ask. I'll use one example. The young people are living longer with their parents. So since that happens, questions we can ask are, is enmeshment an issue if they live with them longer? Another thing is, as an adult living with parents, how is the hierarchy or the power of the family divided? One would assume that in younger years, the parents were at the top of the hierarchy, the children were at the bottom. But now that they're all adults living together, what happens? Do roles change as children grow into adults and they still live at home? So all of those statistics tell social workers that times have changed. Therefore, family function has changed. So there will be a lot of questions that need to be asked. For those who were raised in the prior generations, people like me, It's going to take a lot of self-awareness to be impartial and maybe non-judgmental when working with certain family structures during family assessments. And it isn't just about the makeup of the family unit. It's also about behaviors within the family unit. Just living in our fast moving and rapidly changing culture leads to stress. And that stress can be reflected within a family in a variety of ways. So, the behaviors a social worker may witness might be reflective of a symptom due to the cultural and the social changes and stresses that are occurring outside of the family. So the social worker must understand that he or she will need to be aware of, are the changes coming from outside or are they coming from within the family unit? The social worker must also acknowledge and understand his or her own perspectives and beliefs, as well as identify why families are reaching out for help because they might not even know where their stressors are coming from. Now, Hepworth and Associates also make it clear on page 254 that social workers are not necessarily required to accept client family worldviews at face value, nor are they required to change their own family worldviews when they conflict with those of their clients. In both extreme and subtle ways, culturally sanctioned family structure and family function practices can be oppressive, warranting social work interventions based on empowerment principles and advocacy. Now, the book references female genital mutilation. That's an extreme example. However, in some cultures, it is acceptable. Here in America, if a social worker is faced with this issue, the social worker should not accept this family worldview. It's clearly harmful. So, according to Hepworth, the social worker is advised to consult a variety of frameworks, including professional codes of ethics, legal codes, public policy, the social work agency's values and missions, as well as human rights frameworks. In family assessment, the role of self awareness is extremely important. From my perspective, the crucial component of this self awareness comes from the social worker's assumptions and worldviews in the context of helping clients who have different beliefs and worldviews. The social worker is the one who must deeply reflect and understand their own position so that they can then decide how their belief systems will impact the work with the clients who are holding differing views. Now, moving on to cultural values. Cultural values influence beliefs about family membership and family functioning in the same way that I recognize that my family has influenced my perspective as to the way that I view other families. What you are taught, what you have learned through watching and imitating, what you have experienced, these influence a person's worldview. Linda Gant said it very clearly in her article in the Santa Maria Times. The article was entitled, How Does Culture Affect Behavior? She states, culture is a belief about ethics, behaviors, and values held by a majority of people within a society. The type of culture, either individualistic or collective, into which a person is born affects and influences thoughts and behaviors. And it also influences what that person believes. So, for example, someone growing up in a collective or tight culture where rules are strongly enforced, they may not support individualistic thought or behavior. However, persons who are raised in an individualistic or loose culture, they may have more latitude in how they behave and what they believe. So, whatever cultural values and beliefs are held, those same values and beliefs are going to be upheld within family units because culture translates into family structure. It all goes hand in hand. So, depending on what those beliefs are, that will dictate the logistics of family membership and family functioning. Now, as I watched the family dinner clip, I saw a family that hurt each other with their words. It began with complaints about the meal that the father overcooked. And in response, the father laughed, although intuitively a viewer would understand that that was a painful jab at him. Then a woman asks the young man, Andy, how his drumming is going. Andy starts to respond to her, but is interrupted by more people arriving. Immediately, the adults start bragging on the two young men who had just gotten there. They seem to go around the table congratulating each other boisterously. And finally, they get back to Andy and ask about his music. So again, Andy begins to speak, but rather than being excited for his accomplishments, the people at the table start picking those accomplishments apart, almost mockingly. Then the boisterous bragging on the other boys begins again. So meanwhile, Andy is clearly hurt and angry. And now, Andy interjects negative comments just like the others did to him. Immediately, the people at the table turn on Andy. So Andy leaves the table. Now, that is a synopsis of the clip that we watched. And during that clip, I was made very aware of the poor treatment of Andy. Clearly, there's a bar that this family has set in place in terms of what constitutes success. And Andy has not reached that bar. It was also clear that this was typical as to how the family communicated. Right at the beginning, Andy's father was made fun of for having overcooked the meal. The father laughed uncomfortably, but Andy did not laugh. He knew that that was not appropriate behavior. I was made aware of how important fair and respectful treatment of others is. The Code of Ethics addresses this clearly in its values and in the ethical principles it lists. Every person has dignity and worth, and they should be treated as such. Healthy and functional families should speak respectfully and listen to others. This family did not do that very well. I would say that this family thinks very little about each other. Each of them was self centered rather than accepting individual members of the family just based on their own uniqueness and their own abilities and talents. They didn't, because Andy, the one who is the example here, did not reach their bar. So this seemed to be an unwritten path to achievement, and it was trying to mold everybody into the same mold. I noticed that the family did use feedback loops, as described in Hepworth and Associates on page 255. These feedback loops were used to continually reinforce the fact that Andy's music was not acceptable, but football and scholastic achievements were acceptable. I also believe that the uncle, and I assume that is who that other man was in the clip, and also the father of the two boys, he kept everyone, including Andy's father, in check. He wanted to be at the top of the family hierarchy, and he achieved this through sarcasm and by putting other people down and building his own sons up. Now, the two young men were clearly trying to prove their worth by bragging on themselves and demeaning Andy. So it was an interesting dynamic to watch that. According to Felicia Lynn of joinonelove.org, this phenomenon is called belittling. The definition of belittle can be easily surmised from the two words that it is made up of, be and little. Said another way, belittling is language or behavior that literally makes someone feel small, unimportant, inferior, or minimized. According to Lynn, this is an emotional abuse tactic because it becomes a pattern of abuse over time. Lynn also gives 7 signs of this type of treatment. Number 1 is criticizing. Number 2 is trivializing. Number 3, putting people down. Number 4, condescension. Number 5, insults. Number 6, discounting. And number 7, manipulation. In this short clip, it's easy to find all 7 of those tactics utilized by this family. So my personal beliefs and values, which are treating people with respect and dignity, just like the Code of Ethics states, were reinforced by watching this clip. This family functioned in a dysfunctional way, and it clearly hurt people. The illustrated family does not appear to really recognize how unhealthy their methods of communication really are. Although they are hurt by the actions of others, they perpetuate the problem by turning around and hurting others in the same way. It appears that Andy might have some insight into the problem. He was not happy with the way that his father was treated. And also, when people interrupted him, he just sat back and you could tell he was contemplating. But when his anger flared, he too turned to belittling. So perhaps that's a learned behavior for him, and perhaps it's a learned behavior for the whole family. Now, working with this family would definitely challenge me. As I've already mentioned, I felt the rejection of Andy by the others. I would intuitively want to help him and lecture the rest of the family. But to build an authentic relationship with the family, I clearly don't want to do that. But I would need to get to know each of them individually. I suspect the other young men in this clip were also hurting. They had to work hard to get the approval that I'm sure that they were wanting. I would need to hear each person's story because within those stories, there can be found understanding. I realize that family therapy involves the whole family, but a brief individual glimpse into each person can only help a social worker identify the heart, the mind, the thoughts, the roles, the family rules, how everything's perceived. It can just help. So, if I were the social worker, I would also use the strategy described on pages 270 to 271 in the Hepworth and Associates textbook. It's called Observing Patterns of Interaction. In the clip, it's clear that the family's interactions are not healthy at all. So, it seems that this would be the best choice for them. And I'm reading from the text, in order to assess family system structure, social workers first assess the sequence of interactions that occur between members. All families play out scenarios or a series of transactions in which they manifest redundancies in behavior and communication. Learning about these repetitive patterns of verbal communication, nonverbal communication, and behavior among family members provides clues about the presence and strength of family systems boundaries. Decision-making authority and power, roles, rules, and adaptive capacity. In their assessments of family system structure, social workers use interviewing skills, asking questions to reveal repeated sequences of interactions surrounding a presenting problem, and also observe family interactions that occur in the presence of the social worker. So that would definitely be the one that I would choose. Now, I would choose it too because it is through this family's communication that I became very aware that there are issues within the family. I think that's it. So thank you for listening.